The dusk settled over the plains like a veil of ash, turning the horizon into a narrow band of dying light. Wind pushed over the grass in long, weary strokes, flattening it as though the land itself were bowing under some unseen weight. A storm had passed earlier, leaving the earth slick and mottled with dark puddles that reflected the dim sky. In the center of it all, the girl moved slowly, her small boots sinking into the mud with every step until even the effort to lift her foot felt like a plea the world ignored. Cold gnawed at her fingertips. She pulled her thin coat tighter, though the fabric had long since surrendered any warmth. Her breath left her in soft clouds, fading as quickly as it came. She kept walking because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering why her legs trembled, why her ribs ached, and why she had no one left to call her name across the fields. By the time she reached the fence line, she was shaking from something deeper than chill. Beyond the posts stretched a vast spread of land, quiet, solemn, and heavy with the scent of horses and distant wood smoke. She did not know whose ranch it was. She only knew she could not take another step. Her knees buckled, the mud greeted her with a cold slap, and her palms pressed into the wet earth as though she meant to pray or surrender. Her stomach clenched, a long, slow twist that reminded her she had eaten nothing since the morning before, and even then it had been only a crust of bread. She lifted her head just slightly. The ranch house stood far across the yard, weathered timber washed pale by years of wind and sun. A lantern burned in the window, steady and golden, too warm to belong in a world like this. She blinked hard, wondering if her mind had invented it. But the light held. She crawled a few inches before her arms collapsed. A sob escaped her, thin and tired, more breath than sound. The sky above dimmed further, and the wind carried the scent of rain-soaked sage. She was small against the endless land, small against the night, small against everything that had brought her to this place. She tried to stand again, but pain flared sharp in her legs. She whispered a plea without words and closed her eyes. A horse's snort broke through the dusk. Bootsteps followed, slow, steady, measured. They stopped near her, where the mud bore the imprint of her fall. She felt the presence before she saw him, a tall shadow outlined by the faint lantern glow. His coat flapped in the wind, and the brim of his hat cast his face in darkness, though she sensed he was studying her with a mixture of caution and something softer. For a moment he did nothing. The world held its breath. Then he crouched beside her. She felt his gloved hand hover above her shoulder before it finally settled there, gentle, careful, as though he feared she might break beneath his touch. "You are hurt," he said quietly, voice low as thunder rolling in some far canyon. She swallowed, tasting mud and fear. Her throat burned when she tried to speak, and it took all she had to manage a hoarse murmur. "I am sick. I cannot walk. May I stay one night?" Wind rushed between them. She braced herself for refusal, for suspicion, for the cold dismissal she had learned to expect from grown men hardened by the world. But the stranger only looked at the sky, then at her trembling fingers. He slid an arm beneath her knees and another around her back, lifting her with surprising ease. Her head fell against his chest, where she could hear the steady, unhurried rhythm of his heartbeat, calm, certain, like the earth itself had found its pulse again. "You will stay," he said simply, as though the decision had been made long before she asked. "One night, or more if needed." Her eyes stung. She tried to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. He carried her across the yard, boots squelching in the mud, the lantern light growing brighter with each step. The house loomed larger now, its walls lined with memories she could not yet imagine, and shadows she did not yet fear. When he reached the porch, he kicked the mud from his boots and nudged the door open with his shoulder. Warm air greeted them, wood smoke, stew, the faint scent of leather worn by years of work. He carried her inside, as though she weighed nothing at all. For the first time in days, she felt heat against her skin. Not comfort yet, not safety, but possibility, thin as thread, fragile as breath, but real. He set her gently on a worn sofa near the hearth, where the fire glowed in shades of orange and faint blue. She watched the flames dance, her vision blurring at the edges. He removed his hat and coat, setting them aside, and she saw his face clearly weathered, stern at first glance, but softened by eyes that held the quiet ache of a man who had known both loss and endurance. She shivered as the warmth settled into her bones. He noticed. "I will bring you water," he said. "Then we will see to your fever." She nodded faintly. Outside, the rain began again, soft at first, then steady, drumming against the roof like a lullaby meant for someone who had wandered too long. Inside, she let her gaze follow the firelight until sleep tugged at her limbs with gentle insistence. She did not fight it. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let herself rest. The night passed slow and dreamless, punctuated only by the distant mutter of thunder and the constant, gentle crackle of the fire. Sometime in the darkness, the fever broke. Sweat gathered along her brow and ran cold down her temples. When she tried to rise, a rough woolen blanket cocooned her, tucking her into the deep cushions of the old sofa. The room was dim, painted orange by the coals and the weak, silvery light that pushed through the rain-streaked window. Shadows reached up the wall, stretching long arms toward the ceiling beam. The world outside remained hidden behind a shroud of mist, but here inside, the air was still and close, scented with cedar and the sharp tang of boiled herbs. She blinked, eyes adjusting to the shapes around her: a battered oak table bearing a chipped blue bowl, a wooden chair angled just so, a set of boots placed neatly by the door. There was a hush to the place, the kind born from years of solitude. Every surface bore the mark of hands that worked, hands that built and mended and sometimes shook with the weight of memory. A soft clang broke the quiet. She looked toward the kitchen. The man moved there, back turned, shoulders squared in the half-light. He moved with a careful rhythm, pouring water into a kettle, stirring the embers. She watched the way he wiped his hands on a faded cloth, every movement deliberate, unhurried, like he believed in making things last. She wanted to speak, but the words tangled up with a cough that rattled her chest. He turned at the sound, and his eyes, gray as river stones, rimmed with sleeplessness, met hers. "Good morning," he said, voice softer than the night before. "How do you feel?" She tried to answer, managed only a small nod. Her throat was sandpaper and ache, but the pounding behind her eyes had eased. He knelt beside her and handed her a cup of water. The ceramic was warm in her hands. She drank slowly, letting each sip settle her nerves. When she finished, he took the cup and refilled it without a word. "Soup's on the stove," he said. "Broth and root vegetables. It is not much, but it will help." She studied him in the hush that followed. He looked tired but not unkind, lines at the edges of his mouth deepened by weather and worry. A faint scar ran from his ear down to his jaw, catching the light like a thread of silver. There was something about him that reminded her of the landscape, stark, weather-beaten, but capable of surprising gentleness. "Thank you," she rasped, surprised at the sound of her own voice. He only nodded and stood, crossing the room to retrieve a ladle and bowl. As he poured the soup, she let her gaze drift to the window. Rain fell steady, tracing silver rivers down the glass. In the yard, the horses had gathered near the fence, manes tangled and dark with wet. Beyond them, the fields disappeared into fog, a borderless world, empty but for wind, and the distant shapes of trees stripped bare for winter. He set the bowl in her hands. Steam curled upward, carrying the scent of onion, potato, and something green she could not name. She cupped it in both palms, letting the heat work into her bones. "What is your name?" he asked after a moment. She hesitated, staring into the broth. "Lila," she whispered. "My name is Lila." He gave the smallest nod, as if this knowledge confirmed something he had already guessed. "I am Silas," he said. "You are safe here, Lila." The words hung in the air between them. She nodded, though she was not sure yet if she believed it. They sat, in silence, the crackle of the fire and the drum of rain filling the space that words could not. Outside, dawn crept across the land, pale and uncertain. After a time, Silas moved to the window and peered into the gray. He seemed to consider the day's work, the endless chores a ranch demanded, no matter who lay sick on the sofa. His hand rested on the window frame, fingers drumming a thoughtful rhythm. She wondered what troubles he held, what stories lay behind his measured quiet. She finished the last of her soup and set the bowl aside. A dull ache still lingered in her legs, but strength was returning, slow as the sun's rise. "Thank you," she said again, a little stronger now. He glanced back at her, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile. "Rest as long as you need," he said. "When you are ready, we will see about some work. This is a working ranch. Even the owner does not get to sit idle." She smiled, small but genuine, for the first time in days. Outside, the rain eased. Light found its way through the clouds, painting the floor in fragile gold. Inside, the world held still. For Lila, the ache in her heart eased, not vanished, not forgotten, but softened, as if by the simple promise of shelter and a name spoken kindly. Later that morning, when the rain faded to a drizzle and the fire shrank to a glow of red coals, Lila found herself standing, legs trembling but bearing her weight. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders and limped toward the window, drawn by the distant clatter of hooves and the soft bellow of cattle moving somewhere beyond the barn. The world outside was sodden, alive with a hush after storm, as if the earth itself were catching its breath. Silas was already outside, shoulders hunched against the wind, moving among the horses with the slow, sure movements of a man who belonged to the land. She watched him check the rails, pour feed, murmur to the old mare with a patience that made even the animals pause and listen. There was no rush in his labor, only steadiness, as though each task was a part of some larger rhythm that kept loneliness and memory at bay. The sky brightened by inches, casting pale light over the wide, battered yard. Lila let her eyes wander the edges of the ranch, tracing the way the fence line vanished into mist, the way the wind caught in the bare cottonwoods and set them whispering to one another. She thought of the road behind her, a long, empty stretch bordered by nothing, by the bones of dreams and the dust of things lost. She did not want to remember the things that had brought her here, the rough hand that pushed her out, the door slammed shut, the night spent shivering beneath a stranger's porch as voices argued inside. She carried these memories like stones in her pocket, too heavy to let go. A knock at the door startled her. Silas stepped inside, boots leaving muddy prints on the worn boards. He glanced at the blanket over her shoulders, the way she clung to its warmth. "You are up," he said, and there was a note of approval hidden in the simple words. She nodded, uncertain if she had earned the praise. "I can help, if you want." He considered her, eyes narrowing as though weighing her offer against some secret standard. Then he set his hat on a peg by the door. "There is always work to be done. If you are willing, I will show you." She let the blanket drop and followed him out. The air was sharp, tinged with the scent of wet hay and manure. Her boots slipped in the mud, but she kept her head high. Silas led her to the barn, where the tools leaned against the wall like soldiers lined up for inspection. He handed her a bucket, not too heavy, and showed her how to gather eggs from the nervous hens, how to scatter feed so the chickens calmed, how to move slowly. Let the animals grow accustomed to her scent. Her fingers fumbled at first, too clumsy from days of hunger and cold, but Silas did not scold. He watched, nodded, and offered advice only when she asked. The work was rough but honest. She felt the ache in her arms and the sting in her palms as she lifted, carried, poured, and swept. Later, she watched him mend a gate, his hands rough but careful, humming a tune she could not name. She realized he was younger than she first thought, not old, but worn down by weather and solitude. There was a story in his silence, in the way he looked to the horizon between each core. They worked side by side as the sun climbed, breaking through the last of the cloud and spilling gold across the pasture. For the first time, Lila felt something like hope stirring beneath her ribs, a fragile, bird-like flutter that surprised her. At midday, Silas brought out bread and cheese wrapped in a cloth. They sat on the porch, boots drying in the thin sun. She ate slowly, savoring each bite as though it might be the last. The silence between them was easy, filled with the lowing of cattle and the wind through the grass. "Where will you go when you are well?" he asked quietly, eyes fixed on the horizon. She shrugged, uncertain. "I have nowhere, not anymore." He nodded, neither pitying nor cold. "Then you are welcome here, so long as you pull your weight." A rush of gratitude caught in her throat. She only nodded, unable to trust her voice. The sun burned brighter. In the distance, hawks circled over the fields. The ranch, battered and rough-edged, felt for a moment like something close to belonging. In the days that followed, Lila settled into the rhythms of ranch life, each sunrise pried open by the hungry ball of calves, each evening stitched shut by the slow hush of dusk settling over the prairie. She woke before the light, arms aching but steadier now, hands chapped but eager to work. The routine became a balm for her restlessness, feeding stock, hauling water, mending fence line. The work left no room for the old gnawing ache of fear. She learned quickly. Silas taught her with the same quiet patience he gave his horses, demonstrating, never commanding, letting her fail and try again. He showed her how to check a hoof for stone, how to braid rope, how to swing a hammer true. He told her the names of each horse, each cow, as if their histories mattered, as if memory alone could keep them safe. It was the land, though, that taught her most. She listened to the wind, learned to read the promise of weather in the way the clouds bunched low or the grass flattened in sudden gusts. She watched the hawks hunt and the foxes vanish into the underbrush, silent as memory. Meals were quiet affairs. They shared what little they had: beans, bread, wild onions pulled from the far edge of the garden. Silas ate sparingly, eyes always watching the windows, as if expecting something, trouble or memory. Lila could not say. Sometimes she caught him staring into the middle distance, jaw set, fingers restless on the rim of his mug. At night, when she lay in the small attic room he'd given her, she wondered what kept him up so late, moving about the house with footsteps soft as regret. One evening, after a long day spent repairing the north fence, Silas let himself talk a little more. The sun was low, bleeding gold across the hills. Lila sat beside him on the porch, watching the shadows reach for the barn. "My father built this place," Silas said. He spoke as if to the horizon, his voice spare but steady. "Board by board, every bit of it earned. He used to say the land takes everything and gives nothing back, but he stayed just the same." She listened, sensing how rare these words were. "He died 2 winters ago, pneumonia. Left the place to me, though some days I think it was more a burden than a gift." He rubbed his hands together, rough and scarred. "Most folks leave. There is nothing to keep them here. No gold, no glory. Just work. Just the wind and the sky and the promise that tomorrow will look much like today." Lila looked down at her hands, nails broken, palms lined with new blisters. She knew what it meant to inherit nothing but hardship. "I had a brother once," she said softly, "but he went west, chasing something, never wrote back." A long silence opened between them, filled with the steady breathing of the land and the far-off yip of a coyote. In that hush, something fragile passed between them, a recognition, maybe, of sorrow not spoken but shared. "Folks like us," Silas said. "We are stubborn. The land wants to break us, but we keep getting up." She nodded. The sky above them darkened to indigo, the first stars blinking on. It was as if they sat at the edge of the world, their stories spinning out to join the silence of prairie and night. In that quiet, Lila felt her loneliness ease, still present, still aching, but not so sharp. She was not healed, not whole, but the work and the land and the rough kindness of the man beside her had built something new inside her, a place where hope could root. As the first chill crept into the evening, Silas stood and went inside, leaving the door open behind him, a small, silent invitation. Lila followed, her heart lighter than it had been in many moons. As the first hints of spring brushed the land, cold mornings, followed by afternoons, fragrant with thaw, Lila's world widened with each passing day. She grew stronger, no longer stumbling with fatigue, and learned to read Silas's moods as easily as she read the sky. He moved through the days with a quiet focus, words as spare as winter branches. But when she caught him watching her struggle with a stubborn calf or coaxing shoots from the hard garden soil, she sometimes saw a trace of pride flicker behind his reserved gaze. There was peace in their daily partnership, a comfort born not from easy conversation but from the trust of shared work. They spoke little, but every gesture was a language of its own. Silas nodding in approval when she wrangled a gate closed before the cattle scattered, Lila leaving his battered hat on the porch rail where the sun would dry it, their routines gradually knitting together. In the long shadows of evening, they sat side by side on the porch steps, boots caked with mud, breath clouding the cooling air, content with the silence. Yet even as the days stretched longer and the land began to forgive, old burdens crept in at the edges. One afternoon, while Lila scrubbed the porch planks, a figure rode up the lane, a woman draped in city black, hair drawn back severe and neat, face pinched and eyes sharp as wire. Her buggy gleamed new against the battered fence line. Silas stood straighter when the woman alighted, shoulders tensed as if bracing for a blow. "Mrs. Duncan," he greeted her, voice flat as the plane. The woman's gaze swept the yard and landed on Lila, her lips pressed thin. "I see you have found yourself an assistant, Silas. I hear tell from town that you have taken in a stray." Lila felt her cheeks heat, hands tightening on the scrub brush. Silas's jaw worked, a muscle jumping at his temple. "She is under my roof, doing honest work, that is all." Mrs. Duncan's gaze slid back to Lila, appraising. "We are a respectable community here, Mr. Wright. I hope you are not making yourself the subject of more rumors." Lila felt herself shrink, old shame rising up. She stared at the boards beneath her knees, afraid to meet the woman's eyes. Silas's answer was quiet but hard. "Folks can say what they please. It is my land." The woman's nostrils flared. "There are rules, Silas, and reputations to keep. I will remind you there is talk of the bank tightening loans. I would hate to see you struggle more than you already do." With that, Mrs. Duncan swept back to her buggy. The horse clattered away, her shadow trailing long across the yard. For a long time after, Silas remained by the gate, face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. Lila scrubbed in silence, throat tight with unshed words. Later that night, over a supper of beans and wild greens, Lila found her courage. "I can go," she whispered, "if it brings you trouble." Silas's fork stilled mid-air. He studied her, eyes tired but honest. "You brought me no trouble," he said at last. "If there is any shame, it is not yours to bear." He reached across the table, rough hand covering hers. His touch was warm, grounding. In the flicker of lamplight, she saw the truth in his face. He had chosen her. This life, the risks and all. Outside, a late wind rattled the eaves, but inside, Lila felt steadier than she ever had. Somewhere deep within, hope took root and began to grow. Trouble did not wait long to test them. It came one raw morning, when frost still lingered in the grass and the wind tasted of distant snow. Lila was hauling buckets from the well when she saw two men on horseback riding slow up the lane, their silhouettes hard-edged against the pale sky. One wore a sheriff's badge dull with age, the other a younger man with a restless jaw and eyes sharp as glass. They dismounted by the porch, boots thudding heavy on the frozen ground. Silas met them at the door, broad shoulders blocking the threshold. Lila felt her heart clench as she set her bucket down and watched, uncertain if she should run or stand her ground. "Mornin', Wright," the sheriff said, tipping his hat, though his voice was without warmth. "Mornin', Sampson," Silas answered, his own voice stripped bare, unyielding. The younger man spat into the dust. "We are looking for a girl, thin, brown hair, maybe 12 years old, gone missing from the orphan's wagon outside town. Word is, she was seen walking this way." Silas's jaw tightened. "I have a hand working for me. Her name is Lila. She is no thief, no runaway." The sheriff eyed the house, then Lila, then back to Silas. "You know the rules, Silas. Orphaned or not, she belongs to the county, not you. You harbor her, you answer for it." Lila's knees shook. She wanted to call out, to explain how she was no thief, no troublemaker, only tired and sick, and needing a place to rest. But her tongue felt too thick and her lungs too small. Silas's eyes found hers, steady as stone. "She stays," he said quietly, "as long as she chooses. If you have business, you bring your proof." The younger man stepped forward, hands curled in fists. "We can bring a paper if you like, but it would be easier if she just left now." Inside the house, the lamps still burned, casting their shadows long across the ground. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind caught at the sheriff's coat, rattling it like a warning. At last, Sampson let out a slow breath. "You have 2 days, Silas. If we do not hear from the county, I come back, and this time I will not come alone." The men mounted up and rode away. their threats hanging in the chill air long after their hoofbeats faded. Silas turned to Lila. She stood on the step, fists clenched at her sides, breath shaking in her chest. He came to her quietly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "You are not what they say," he said. "Not to me. I know the difference between a stray and a survivor." Tears stung her eyes, sharp and hot, but she blinked them away. "I can hide if you want, out by the creek or in the barn." He shook his head. "We do not run from shadows here. Let them come. This land was built on standing your ground." His words settled over her like a blanket, heavy but warm. For the rest of that day, they worked as always, side by side, mending fence, splitting wood, tending animals. But something new pulsed beneath the silence. The knowledge of danger waiting on the horizon, and the fierce comfort of not having to face it alone. That night, as darkness crept across the fields, Lila lay awake in her attic bed, listening to the wind press against the house. For the first time in her wandering life, she did not dream of escape. She dreamed instead of staying. Morning brought a sky the color of pewter and the sense of waiting that comes before a storm. Silas was up early, tending horses in the half-light, moving with a restlessness Lila had not seen before. She joined him in silence, boots crunching in the frost, her breath fogging in the cold. He glanced at her, nodded once, then handed her a curry comb. Together, they worked in the hush. The only sounds, the horse's gentle snorts and the rasp of bristles against dusty hide. The threat of the sheriff's return hung in the air. Lila felt it in her bones, a low ache that made her hands clumsy and her chest tight. Yet with each task, each bale of hay stacked, each trough filled, she found herself clinging harder to the small routines of the ranch. The work was an anchor, a promise that she still belonged here, at least for now. As noon drew close, the wind shifted. She heard the distant rattle of harness and the creak of wagon wheels on frozen ruts. Silas straightened, eyes narrowing as he looked toward the lane. The sheriff returned, as promised, but this time there were more with him, 3 men from town and Mrs. Duncan, her dress as black as before, mouth set in a hard line. They gathered by the porch, the crowd's muttering carried on the wind. Silas met them alone. Lila watched from the barn door, nerves strung tight. The men fanned out behind Samson, all bluster and broad shoulders. Mrs. Duncan looked past Silas, scanning for Lila with the cold scrutiny of someone who had already decided the truth. Samson spoke first. "We brought the paper, Silas, and the witnesses." Silas took the document, eyes flicking over it. His voice did not tremble. "It says here she is to be remanded to county care." The younger man from before crossed his arms. "The law is the law. You knew it when you took her in." Silas's reply was quiet, but it carried. "Law is not always right. This girl did nothing but survive." Mrs. Duncan stepped forward, voice clipped. "This is not a place for orphans. You know what folks will say if you keep her." Lila could not stand it any longer. She stepped from the barn, shoulders squared though her legs threatened to give. "I am not a thief. I came here sick and tired and hungry. Silas gave me work, a roof, nothing more." For a heartbeat, silence pressed down like a weight. Samson turned to her, features softening, if only for a moment. "Lila, do you want to go with us?" She shook her head. "I want to stay." Mrs. Duncan's eyes narrowed. "And what about your future, child? You will not get far with a man like Silas. No family, no prospects, just hardship." Lila looked at Silas, at the stubborn line of his jaw, at the honest worry in his eyes. "This is the first place I have ever felt safe," she said. "I will take hardship over hunger. I will take this land, these chores, this life." The men shifted uncomfortably. The sheriff sighed, looking older than before. "Sometimes the law makes no sense," he murmured. "But the law stands." He handed Silas the paper. "You have until morning. After that, it is out of my hands." The group left, Mrs. Duncan glancing back once, her expression unreadable. Silence filled the yard as hoofbeats faded. Silas turned to Lila, pride and sorrow warring in his face. "We still have tonight," he said. She nodded. "Then let us make it count." That evening, they ate supper by lantern light. The world outside pressed close and cold. Silas told her stories of his father, of old winters survived and years when hope was nothing more than the sound of spring frogs in the marsh. Lila listened, drawing courage from the stories, from his voice, from the stubborn fact of their togetherness. When night came, she did not lie awake in fear. Instead, she watched the shadows on the ceiling, listened to the deep silence of the ranch, and made her own vow. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would not run. Dawn came slow and pale, the kind of morning that stains the fields with silver and hangs the world between hope and dread. Lila dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with buttons as the chill bit through her shirt. Downstairs, Silas sat at the table, a mug cooling in his hands, unreadable in the fragile light. He looked up when she entered. His face was drawn, shadowed with worry, but in his eyes there was something steady, unbroken. He pushed a plate of bread toward her. She forced herself to eat, every bite rough with memory. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath. Frost sparkled on the grass, the barn doors hung open, and the horses stood quietly, steam curling from their nostrils. Lila went about her chores, pitching hay, fetching water, her movements careful, deliberate, as though by sheer will she could keep time from moving forward. They did not speak of what might come. There was nothing left to say. By mid-morning, wheels crunched on the lane. Lila wiped her hands and glanced at Silas, who stood by the window, shoulders squared, gaze hard as riverstone. Together, they stepped onto the porch, the door swinging closed behind them with a soft click. The sheriff arrived first, alone this time. He removed his hat, turned it in his hands. Behind him, Mrs. Duncan's buggy came to a stop, her presence dark as a storm cloud. Townsfolk lingered at a distance, drawn by the promise of trouble or justice, whichever the morning might bring. Samson cleared his throat. "Morning, Silas. Morning, Lila." His voice was softer than before, almost gentle. "I have come for an answer." Silas stood a little taller. "She stays," he said. "If there is a price, I will pay it. This land is mine, and the law is not always right." Mrs. Duncan's lips thinned, but before she could speak, a new voice rang out. From the gathered crowd, a woman stepped forward, a neighbor from the far ridge, with a face lined deep from sun and wind. "She's no burden," the woman said, her voice carrying over the cold morning. "That girl pulled my boy from the creek last week when the ice gave. Nearly lost him, if not for her." Another voice joined, a grizzled rancher with a battered hat. "She helped me patch a foal at midnight. Did not ask for pay, just a blanket for her trouble." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A small, wiry man with a shopkeeper's apron raised a hand. "And she brings eggs to town every Friday, never asks for more than her share." The sheriff turned, surprise flickering in his tired eyes. Mrs. Duncan glared at the crowd. "This is not about good deeds. There are laws." But the neighbor woman cut her off. "Sometimes law needs mending, same as a broken fence." Samson looked from Silas to Lila, then back to the faces behind him. He let out a long sigh. "Seems to me the county can spare a girl who has found her place," he said. "If there are no further complaints." He left the words hanging. No one spoke up. Mrs. Duncan's glare flickered, but she said nothing. Relief flooded Lila's chest, sharp and sweet. Silas let out a breath he had been holding for days. The sheriff nodded once, not unkind, and turned away. The crowd drifted, conversation rising, faces softening. On the porch, Silas rested a hand on Lila's shoulder. The sun climbed higher, gold burning away the last of the frost. They stood there a long while, side by side, as the land warmed beneath their feet. A new day, uncertain but entirely theirs, spread out before them, a future built on defiance, on kindness, on the stubborn hope that grows in unlikely soil. That afternoon the world seemed changed, as if every fence post, every scrub oak, every ripple in the grass had quietly shifted. The fear that had shadowed Lila's days was gone, replaced by a calm so new it made her hands tremble. The ranch no longer felt borrowed, but earned a place where she was wanted, not merely endured. Silas set to work mending a length of broken fence at the north end of the pasture, and Lila followed, hammer and wire in hand. The air was clear, bright with the sense of sun-warmed sage and distant blossoms just starting to break through the soil. They worked without hurry, pausing sometimes to look out over the fields, to watch the cattle graze, or to listen to the hawks' lazy calls drifting high above. It was not long before neighbors began to trickle down the lane. The woman from the far ridge brought a sack of potatoes and a shy smile. The shopkeeper's boy ran up with a basket of eggs. A rancher stopped by with seeds for planting, and an offer to help repair the barn roof, if Silas would take the favor. In each gesture was a quiet acknowledgement not of charity, but of kinship, the kind earned in shared struggle. Lila, unused to the warmth of welcome, felt at first overwhelmed. But as the afternoon wore on, she let herself laugh with the neighbors' children, her voice mingling with theirs on the wind. She listened to the stories traded over the fence, learned names and histories, and the little kindnesses that stitched a community together. When the sun tilted low and gold across the prairie, Silas paused at the gate, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at Lila not as a ward or a stranger, but as something closer to an equal, maybe even kin. "You did good," he said simply, voice rough with pride. Lila smiled, a real smile, as wide and bright as the sky. "So did you." Evening came on slow. The neighbors drifted home, promises of shared work and Sunday supper lingering in the hush. Lila helped Silas bring in the horses, their breath warm on her hands, their weight solid and patient. She savored the sound of the barn doors closing, the day's labor done. After supper they sat on the porch steps, the world wrapped in a soft growing twilight. Fireflies blinked in the yard, and a chorus of frogs sang down in the marsh. Silas handed Lila a scrap of leather, rough and shaped into a ring. "It was my mother's," he said. "She would have wanted it passed along to someone stubborn enough to stay." Lila traced the worn band, eyes stinging with grateful tears she did not bother to hide. She slipped it on, feeling the weight of belonging, the shape of the future curling close around her hand. "Thank you," she whispered, voice thick with promise. They sat together in the quiet, no more words needed. Above them, stars kindled in the wide, forgiving sky. A breeze rose from the fields, carrying the scent of grass and earth and the promise that tomorrow would come hard, perhaps, but theirs to claim. The world was vast, but in that moment it felt just small enough to hold them both. The weeks that followed grew gentle with the first green blush of spring. Lila's days filled with honest sweat and the ache of new purpose, planting rows of potatoes with her hands deep in the black loam, scrubbing mud from the horses' hooves, sweeping sunlight from the floorboards with each stroke of her broom. The land answered to her in small ways. The beans pushed up through the soil, the chickens fattened, and the garden spread a quilt of green along the fence. Life became something to measure in shared glances and silent understandings. She and Silas worked as partners now, falling into an easy rhythm. At dawn, she rose before the bell, boots already laced and shoulders squared for the day. When storms rolled in from the hills, she watched Silas brace the barn doors and marveled at how he always made space for her in the circle of his labor, never ordering, only trusting, showing her how things were done by the shape of his hands. Sometimes, in the quiet after supper, he spoke of his dreams in a voice so low she almost missed the words. He told her he wanted to breed horses fit for more than work, to raise animals strong but gentle, horses the townsfolk would remember, horses that would carry children to school and old men home from the tavern. He talked of repairing the west fields, of saving for a windmill, of someday building a proper house where every window caught the sunrise. Lila listened, heart swelling with a hope she dared not name. She realized she too had dreams, dreams that grew out of the simple acts of staying, working, and waking in a place where she was seen. She wanted to read more books, to fill the garden with flowers as well as food, to one day teach another stray how to gather eggs without breaking them. But life on the frontier did not soften all at once. There were nights when old fears woke her, when the creak of the house in the wind sent her heart racing. On such nights, Silas would find her by the fire, kettle warming on the coals, and sit with her in silence until sleep came again. It was on an evening like this, the scent of rain heavy in the air, that Silas handed her a scrap of paper covered in his careful, uneven script. "I drew up a partnership," he said, almost shy. "This land is half yours now, if you wish it. You have earned it." Lila traced her finger over her name, written in Silas's hand. She thought of the road behind her, of all the nights spent cold and frightened, of hunger that made the world go thin and gray, and she felt a fierce pride rise in her chest. She nodded, unable to speak. In that moment, her place in the world felt as solid as the land beneath her boots. Later, as the lamps burned low and the frogs sang from the marsh, Silas pressed the old leather ring against her palm once more. "We are kin now," he said, not as a question but as a truth. Lila slid the ring on, feeling its warmth a circle without end. Outside, the land glimmered with fresh rain. Tomorrow would bring new chores, new worries, and new joys. But for now, with Silas beside her and the world finally at rest, she let hope carry her into dream. Summer swept over the ranch in a haze of heat and prairie wildflowers, the fields humming with the low, relentless music of insects. Lila's arms browned and grew strong from labor. Each day she learned something new, the art of coaxing foals from wary mares, how to tell by the angle of a cloud whether rain would come before dusk, and the quiet miracle of coaxing tomato vines to climb. She and Silas moved together like old friends, their partnership deepening in small, wordless ways. Sometimes he would hand her a battered book in the evening tales of the West, seed catalogs, even a Bible with half its pages loose, watching her sound out the words, patient as the hills. On Sundays, they would walk to the edge of the pasture and sit beneath the lone cottonwood, sharing bread and stories, letting silence and sunlight do most of the talking. The townsfolk, once wary, grew used to Lila's presence. Children raced her along the lane. Women from neighboring farms invited her for tea, pressing her for news of the ranch. Men nodded to her in town, their suspicions dulled by the sight of a hard-working girl who gave more than she asked. The community's slow acceptance felt like sunlight warming the coldest corners of her heart. But even as the days grew longer and easier, shadows sometimes flickered at the edge of Lila's thoughts. She would catch Silas watching the horizon, worry knitting his brow when letters came from the bank, or a coyote stole into the chicken coop. He shared more of himself in these quiet hours, stories of his parents, of winters so hard he once nearly gave up the land, of dreams never spoken aloud until now. One night, as a dry wind rattled the windows, Silas sat by the hearth, hands restless in his lap. Lila, sitting cross-legged on the braided rug, watched him struggle for words. "This place, it nearly broke me once," he admitted at last. "The year my father died, I thought I would walk away. Every fence down, every crop lost, every neighbor turning their back. It was easier to believe I did not deserve any better than the hard luck handed me." He looked at her, something raw and honest in his eyes. "But you changed that. You showed me there is more to fight for than just land." Lila listened, heart pounding. She knew the truth of what he said, for she had nearly lost herself to the same hopelessness. Now, sitting by his side, she saw not just a rescuer, but a man who needed saving in his own quiet way. She reached for his hand. "You never needed to be alone here," she said, voice steady. "Not anymore." He held her gaze, searching, as if seeing her for the first time. The firelight flickered over his face, softening the years of worry. "I know that now," he said, and squeezed her hand. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, softening the dust, feeding the roots of everything they had planted together. The old ring on Lila's finger gleamed in the lamplight, a token of survival and of the belonging they had built with their own hands. Later, before bed, Silas lingered in the doorway. "Tomorrow, I want to show you the north field," he said. "We will need to plan for more corn, maybe wheat. This place, it could feed a family someday." Lila smiled, hope blooming inside her like the wildflowers in the grass. "We will make it so," she promised. Night pressed gently against the windows, and the two of them stood together, strong and unafraid, ready for whatever the future might bring. As the heat of summer softened into the gold and copper hush of autumn, life at the ranch settled into a new and deeper fullness. The fields, once spare and brittle, ripened under Lila's hands, rows of beans and potatoes fattened in the earth, corn silk fluttering in the breeze. The orchard behind the barn gave up its apples and pears, and the cellar filled, jar by careful jar, with the sweetness of the year's work. The neighbors came often now, not out of curiosity, but out of custom and friendship. They brought news, laughter, and sometimes their burdens, asking Silas for advice or borrowing Lila's strong arms to help gather in a harvest before an early frost. In the evenings there was the comfort of community, a pot of stew on the table, voices rising in gentle argument, children tumbling across the porch until the stars blinked awake. Lila found herself woven into the fabric of this life in ways she had never imagined. She read aloud by lamplight to Silas and the neighbor children, stumbling at times but always cheered on by grins and soft applause. She stitched new curtains for the kitchen windows, pale yellow as sunlight, and planted rows of wildflowers along the fence for no reason other than beauty. Yet beneath the surface, the wounds of the past had not vanished. Sometimes, in the quiet before dawn, Lila would sit on the edge of her narrow bed, memories pressing close a locked door, the chill of the road, voices raised in anger. She would wrap her arms around her knees and remind herself aloud, "You are here. You are home. You are not alone." On one such morning, Silas found her in the garden, hands dirty with earth and eyes bright with unshed tears. He knelt beside her, rough palms covering hers, and waited without a word. When she finally looked at him, she found no question, only acceptance, his presence steady as the ground beneath them. He spoke softly. "You have brought more to this place than you will ever know, Lila. You turned a house into a home." She smiled, the ache in her chest loosening just a little. "You saved me first," she whispered, "when you carried me in from the cold." He shook his head. "I only gave you a roof. You did the rest. You made me remember I was not meant to be alone either." The day moved forward, gentle and bright. They picked apples together, laughter ringing in the crisp air, and carried baskets to the kitchen, where neighbors gathered to press cider and tell stories. At supper, Silas raised his cup in a quiet toast. "To new beginnings," he said, "and to all we have built together." That night, Lila stood in the yard beneath the pale sweep of stars, the old leather ring cool and familiar on her finger. The world was not perfect, the future was not promised, but the pain of abandonment had given way to something stronger, a sense of belonging, of family found and chosen. As she climbed the porch steps, she looked back once at the glowing windows, at the house alive with laughter and the sound of Silas's voice. She felt herself become part of the land's long story, another layer stitched into the quiet, enduring heart of the prairie. Inside, the hearth burned warm and bright. Tomorrow there would be work fences to mend, bread to bake, and new plans to dream. But tonight, there was only peace and the promise of morning. Winter arrived like a hush, blanketing the ranch in drifts of snow that glowed blue in the moonlight and softened every edge. The fields lay fallow beneath their quilt of white. The trees stood bare, dark arms raised to the heavy sky. Each night, the wind keened around the eaves, and the old house creaked and settled, holding tight to its warmth. Lila had never known a winter that felt like sanctuary. In years past, cold had meant hunger and fear, shivering alone in barns or on station benches, waiting for the world to turn its face. But here, with Silas and the small circle of neighbors who braved the snow to share food and news, winter became a season of slow joys, bread rising on the stove, the steady light of lamplight at dusk, the reassurance of footfalls overhead. Together, they made new traditions. On stormy nights, Silas read aloud by the fire old stories, some his father's, and some from battered books. Lila taught the neighbor children to shape dough into knots and braids, their laughter rising above the wind's howl. When the weather broke and sunlight painted the yard in shards of silver, she and Silas bundled themselves in scarves and went out to break the ice in the troughs, to check for fox tracks, to walk the edges of the land as if to claim it again, step by step. One evening, when the sky blushed with the pale promise of a thaw, Silas pressed something cool into Lila's hand, a silver locket, worn and simple. "My mother's," he said, his voice a little rough. "She gave it to me when I was small, said it was for keeping close what matters. I think it belongs with you now." Lila turned the locket over, feeling the weight of history and trust. She slipped it over her head, the chain resting just above her heart. "I will keep it safe," she promised. Later, they stood together at the window, watching snow sift down, gentle as feathers. In the glass, their reflections blurred and merged, two stories meeting in the warmth of the kitchen's glow. That winter, Silas began drawing up new plans, sketches of a barn addition, dreams of a windmill, ideas for spring calves and another patch of wheat. He spoke to Lila of the future as something certain, not a wish or a gamble, but a promise they would build together. One night, with the hearth crackling low, and the neighbors gone home through snow so deep it silenced their laughter, Silas reached for Lila's hand. "Whatever comes," he said softly, "you and I, we are kin now. By work, by choice, by every hardship we have weathered side by side." Lila squeezed his hand, the ring warm on her finger, the locket cool against her skin. She felt the truth of it settle inside her, steady as the land beneath a coverlet of snow. The wind rose, but inside, the world was safe and still. And as she drifted into sleep, Lila dreamed not of escape, but of a home that would endure, of love rooted deep in honest ground, and of seasons to come, each one richer than the last. When spring finally broke, it came in a rush, warm rains melting the last dirty snow, green blades pushing up through thawed earth, the sun rising earlier each morning as if eager to banish the memory of winter. Lila woke to the sound of water running in the creek again, birds busy in the orchard, calves bawling in the pasture. The ranch stirred with fresh purpose, every corner alive with the business of renewal. She and Silas walked the fields together, boots caked in mud, shoulders brushed by the damp wind. He mapped out where new rows would be planted. She marked the places where wild violets crept through the fence line. The work was endless, but satisfying, the days stretching long and full. Some mornings, neighbors arrived with tools or seeds in hand, children darting around Lila's legs as she worked. The ranch no longer felt set apart, but woven tightly into the fabric of the valley. Silas spoke now more often of the future, not with the guarded hope he once carried, but with the steady certainty of a man who had claimed his share of joy. "We will need a new roof before autumn," he mused, sketching on the back of an old ledger. "The south pasture could take a dozen more head next year, and I think we might try sunflowers along the lane. Something for beauty's sake." Lila listened and offered her own ideas: a new chicken coop, a bookcase for the kitchen, a small patch of herbs beneath the window. In each plan, she saw her own roots growing deeper, tangling into the very heart of the land. One evening, after a long day of mending fences and helping a neighbor deliver twin lambs, Silas returned from town with a letter in his hand. He set it before Lila at the supper table, the envelope crisp and official. "It is from the county," he said, voice cautious but calm. Lila stared at the letter, memories flickering sheriffs at the door, papers that threatened to uproot her once again. With hands only a little unsteady, she broke the seal. The letter was short, her case closed, her status as a ward dissolved. She was, in the eyes of the world, free her own, with no one to claim her or cast her out. Relief came slow, mingled with disbelief. She read the letter again and again, the words blurring with tears. Silas reached across the table, covering her hand with his, and in that gesture was all the certainty she would ever need. Later, they stood beneath the stars, the scent of damp earth and budding trees thick in the night. Silas held her close, arms around her shoulders, as if he too feared she might yet vanish. "You are home," he said simply, "for as long as you wish it." Lila closed her eyes, letting the words settle deep. The land, the house, the wide prairie sky, she belonged to them all, and they belonged to her. In the stillness, a promise took root, one of kinship, of work, of a love grown quiet and steady as the seasons. The future stretched ahead, vast and unknowable, but no longer something to be feared. Together, they would weather it all. By summer's height, the ranch flourished as never before. Sunflowers blazed yellow along the lane, and bees hummed over every patch of clover. Children's laughter carried on the breeze from house to house. The creek ran strong, and even the old mare, who had limped through too many winters, kicked up her heels at dusk. Lila rose each morning before first light, stepping quietly into her boots, moving through the cool hush of the house. She found contentment in simple tasks: the scent of baking bread, the rhythm of milking, the satisfaction of a weeded row. She tended the hens and gathered eggs, kneaded dough while the window fogged with sunrise. Sometimes, after breakfast, Silas would press a kiss to her brow before heading to the barn, a gesture so natural she hardly noticed the way it marked the beginning of her day. Their partnership, forged in hardship, had become something softer and more enduring. They worked side by side, sweat on their brows, smiles exchanged over a gate latch or shared joke. At night, they read together in the kitchen, Lila's finger tracing the words, Silas's quiet patience guiding her. He began teaching her sums and figures, the kind needed to run a business, and Lila found she was not afraid to learn. Word of their prosperity traveled quietly through the valley. Neighbors came with requests for help calves to be delivered, wheat to be threshed, fences to be mended. Lila and Silas never turned anyone away. Their table grew longer, meals stretching late into the evening, laughter and stories brightening every corner of the house. The old wounds lingered, but softer now, woven into the daily fabric of life. Lila sometimes found herself standing at the gate at dusk, watching the road disappear into shadow, the sense of exile replaced by a fierce gratitude for all she had gained. She thought often of the girl she had been a child, shivering in the mud, begging for a night's rest. That memory lived in her still, but it no longer defined her. As the days turned toward harvest, a new kind of hope began to stir. Lila's skirts grew tighter at the waist, and her appetite swelled. One evening, as the fireflies danced and the stars scattered bright across the prairie, Silas pressed his hand to her belly with wonder and awe. "A child," he whispered, voice thick with disbelief and joy. "Ours." Lila laughed, tears sparkling in her eyes. "A family," she answered, the words as sweet as any she had ever spoken. They held each other close beneath the infinite sky, their hearts steady with the knowledge that their story had not ended with rescue or survival. It carried on in every sunrise, every planting, every heartbeat shared beneath the wide and watchful heaven. As summer waned and the prairie readied itself for harvest, Lila traced the line of her home with her hand. The creak of the porch, the warmth of the kitchen, the ring on her finger, the locket at her throat, and the sound of Silas's voice in the next room. All these, she realized, were the gifts of endurance, not just the reward for having survived, but the proof that she could transform pain into belonging, loneliness into love. In every corner of the house, in every field she worked, Lila saw her own quiet legacy. And in that golden season, with the future swelling under her heart, she knew she had finally, truly come home.